In the AR lounge, it's often said that blending families is like trying to mix oil and water. No matter how hard you try, they just don't seem to combine. Today, we're diving into whether tough love really builds character, based on a personal experience that's been weighing heavily on my mind. I'm caught in a rather awkward situation and need some advice or perspective on how to proceed. Here's the backstory. My daughter, Ellie, and my stepson, Jill, simply can't stand each other, and my wife, Kyra, and I are often left trying to mediate their ongoing conflicts. Our marriage is starting to feel the strain from all of this, and I'm finding it difficult to navigate these troubled waters. I'm a 49-year-old man, and I've been married to my second wife, Kyra, who is 46, for 4 years now. Kyra has a 20-year-old son, Jill, from her previous marriage, and I have a 15-year-old daughter, Ellie, from my first marriage. Tragically, Ellie's mother passed away when Ellie was only 7, and since then, I've been raising her as a single parent. A few years after her mother's passing, I met Kyra. She had been divorced for a while, and we connected instantly. We thought we could fill each other's voids, but no one prepared me for the challenge of blending our two families. At first, everything seemed fine. Ellie, who was still in her preteens, was open to having Kyra in her life and embraced her warmly. Kyra reciprocated, forming a good bond with Ellie. However, things were much more complicated with Jill. Jill, being a typical teenager, wasn't particularly interested in what was going on in his mom's life. He was indifferent to the changes and mostly went along with whatever was happening because he had to. When we got married and Jill moved in with us, I was hopeful that things would settle into a routine. At first, the indifference between Jill and Ellie seemed manageable, even preferable to open hostility. But as time passed, Jill's attitude toward Ellie began to shift, and not in a positive way. He started making subtle, passive-aggressive comments about her appearance and her choices, which Ellie, in her quieter way, would try to ignore. But the more Jill pushed, the more Ellie would withdraw, and it broke my heart to see her become a shadow of the bright, confident girl she once was. Kyra and I assumed it was just typical sibling rivalry at first, but as the years went by and Ellie entered her teenage years, the tension escalated. What started as minor squabbles grew into full-blown arguments. Every little thing seemed to set them off. It was exhausting for Kyra and me to constantly mediate, trying to keep the peace, but nothing seemed to work. At the same time, I was holding on to the hope that once Jill went to college, the situation would improve. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Jill chose a college that was close enough to home that he didn't need to stay in a dorm, and he didn't bother to get a job, despite my suggestion. He spent most of his time lounging around, and the hostility between him and Ellie continued to fester. The tipping point came a year ago when Jill made a cruel comment about Ellie's friend during one of their tennis practice sessions. Ellie, humiliated, insisted that Jill apologize. Instead, Jill escalated things further by fat-shaming Ellie, which led to a massive argument. Kyra, in an effort to maintain some semblance of peace, tried to mediate and make Jill apologize, but Jill stormed out of the house in anger. Kyra apologized to Ellie and her friend, but it wasn't enough for them. At that point, we realized we needed to address the situation more seriously. Kyra suggested we take Jill to therapy, but Jill refused, claiming he wasn't crazy. Eventually, we agreed to family counseling, but it only seemed to strengthen the bond between Kyra and Ellie, leaving Jill more isolated. All of our efforts to mend the relationship between the two children were in vain. Despite everything, I was still hopeful that once Jill finished college, he would find a job, move out, and give Ellie some space to breathe. But the situation worsened last week when Jill crossed yet another line. Both Jill and Ellie attend the same tennis academy, where Jill had been making Ellie's life miserable by spreading rumors about her. Some of the rumors were trivial, but one crossed the line, and Ellie came home from practice visibly upset. She locked herself in her room, refusing to talk to anyone. When I came home, I could tell something was off. Ellie refused to speak, and I began to feel a growing sense of anger. Kyra, concerned, asked Jill if he knew what had happened, and he denied everything. But when I pressed him, I could tell something wasn't right. He was smirking across the table, too smug for my liking. I asked him directly, and he brushed it off as just harmless fun. But his tone, dripping with arrogance, made my blood boil. Kyra jumped in, asking him to elaborate, but he acted defensive, saying we were overreacting. At that point, I had enough. I told him to mind his tone and language, but he stood up and stormed out of the house, leaving us all seething with frustration. Later that evening, I went to Ellie's room. I knocked on the door, and though she probably overheard everything, she finally opened it. She was curled up on the couch, sulking, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. At that moment, I realized how much damage Jill had done, and I couldn't help but question my decision to let him into our lives. I'm torn, unsure of how to proceed. How much longer can I tolerate this hostility in my own home? Does tough love truly build character, or is it just causing irreparable harm? Ellie, a quiet and reserved girl, was devastated the moment she broke down in Kiera's arms. Her tears flowed uncontrollably. It all started with Jill, who spread a cruel rumor at tennis school that Ellie had a crush on her coach and was flirting with him to get extra playtime. The coach, a towering figure at 6 feet 4 inches, seemed like a giant compared to Ellie, who was a foot shorter than him. People started teasing her relentlessly, mocking her for supposedly flirting with an older, much taller man. But Ellie wasn't flirting. She simply didn't talk back like the other girls, who often flirted with the coach, and her silence made her an easy target. The cruel rumor spread quickly, and Ellie found herself embarrassed and ridiculed by her peers. Her face flushed with shame as the teasing got more intense. It wasn't the kind of drama she was used to. Ellie had always been someone who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and kept to herself. But Jill, for reasons she couldn't understand, dragged her into this public humiliation. As Ellie sobbed in Kiera's arms, I felt a wave of anger rise within me. I wanted to protect her from the cruelty she was enduring. In the midst of this, we were unaware that Jill had been watching the entire scene unfold. He stepped forward, still laughing, with a smug smirk on his face. "It's just a joke," he said, clearly unfazed by the pain he'd caused. "Everyone's talking about it now. It's hilarious." His laughter sent a chill through the room. Kiera stood up, furious, and snapped at him. "That's not funny. Why would you do that?" I was seething with anger, inching closer to the breaking point. I yelled at Jill to leave, telling him he'd crossed a line and that he'd face consequences for his actions. He tried to argue, but I shouted, "Get out. You're not welcome here anymore." Once he left, I asked Kiera to give us some space. Ellie was hurting, and I knew I needed to comfort her. I pulled Ellie into my arms, apologizing for the turmoil she was going through because of my decision to bring Jill into our lives. Ellie, despite everything, was kind and understanding, assuring me that it wasn't anyone's fault but Jill's. I promised her I would make it right, and after we ate, I told her I would stand by her. I wouldn't let Jill's cruelty go unaddressed. Later that night, I confronted Kiera about Jill's behavior. I could see she was just as concerned about Ellie's well-being, but she was reluctant to take any drastic measures. We both agreed that Jill's actions weren't just a minor sibling squabble. They were bullying, and that kind of behavior couldn't be tolerated. The next day, Kyra and I sat down with Jill. "What you did to Ellie was cruel," I told him. "It's not funny. You need to apologize. Make it clear that it was just a rumor, and never let this happen again." But Jill just looked at us with defiance, unbothered by the gravity of the situation. "I'm not apologizing for a joke," he sneered. "If she can't take it, that's her problem." The frustration in me boiled over. This wasn't just teenage stubbornness. This was maliciousness. I had been supporting Jill financially since marrying his mother, paying for his college, his tennis lessons, everything. And yet, here he was, refusing to take responsibility for his actions. I made it clear, "If you don't apologize, I'll stop paying for your college tuition." That got his attention, but he still scoffed at me. "You can't do that," he said. "Mom won't let you." But Kyra, though shocked, agreed that this was a serious issue. "Your prank has gone too far, Jill. You need to make it right," she said. But Jill just stormed out of the house, his pride still intact, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. Kyra didn't think I was serious about cutting him off, but I was. I knew Jill needed to learn a lesson. And when the tuition payment deadline came, I held my ground. Jill kept pressuring me, but I ignored his calls and emails, determined not to back down. Then, the day before the deadline, Jill confronted me. "Dude, when are you going to pay? The college is chasing me," he said, using that disrespectful slang. I snapped. "Don't ever talk to me like that again, or I'll shove your stupid accent into your lazy butt." I was furious. "And I'm not paying for your tuition anymore unless you take responsibility and apologize for what you did." But Jill just rolled his eyes and walked out, refusing to apologize. The following day, Jill dropped out of college. Kyra was devastated. She tried to reason with him, but he was too proud to admit his mistake. She even offered to liquidate her savings to pay for his tuition, but he refused, accusing her of not standing by him. Despite all the help and sacrifices Kyra had made for him, Jill still blamed her for his own failure. Now, he was spending his days lounging around the house, playing video games, and doing nothing with his life. He hadn't even bothered to look for a job or try to pay for his own education. It was as if he had no intention of taking responsibility for anything. His actions were only getting worse, and I found myself growing increasingly resentful. It was clear to me now. Jill's behavior wasn't just about being a spoiled teenager. It was about refusing to take accountability for his actions and the damage he caused. Kyra was caught in the middle, torn between her love for her son and the reality that Jill's behavior was spiraling out of control. I wanted to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget, but at what cost? The tension between Kyra and me was growing, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep this up without something breaking. I had given him everything, an education, a home, and all the opportunities in the world. And he had thrown it all away over some misguided sense of pride. After weeks of watching him do nothing, I finally confronted Kyra, telling her that Jill needed to be taught a lesson. He had never taken his studies seriously, and cutting off his tuition didn't seem to bother him. The next day, we sat him down and made it clear. If he wasn't going to school, he needed to get a job. He couldn't just sit around expecting us to support him forever. Jill, engrossed in his phone, barely looked up as he muttered, "I'm working on it." I shot back, "No, you're not. You're sitting here waiting for me to give you more money, and that's not happening." He rolled his eyes and replied, "Fine, I'll start my own business. I just need a loan." I couldn't believe it. After everything, he was asking for money to start a business? I stared at him, dumbfounded. "You want me to give you money to start a business after everything you've done?" He looked me straight in the eye with a defiant expression and said, "Yeah, why not?" At that moment, I realized I had tried everything. I had been patient, reasoning with him, offering help, but he had no respect for me or anyone in this house. That was the final straw. It was time for an ultimatum. I told him, "You have two choices. Either start paying rent and utilities, or you move out." He screamed, "Fine," and stormed out. We thought maybe he would start looking for work, but nothing changed. He spent his days as usual, and after a month, I asked him if he'd found a job. He just nodded and said, "Nope." I told him it was time to pack and leave. He stared at me shocked and asked, "You're kicking me out?" I replied, "I'm giving you a choice. You're an adult now. If you're not going to contribute, you can't stay here." He exploded. "You're not my dad. You don't get to tell me what to do." I stood firm. "I may not be your biological father, but I've been supporting you all this time. I'm done. Either you contribute or you leave." He stormed out, slamming doors as he went. A few minutes later, he packed his bags and left without even saying goodbye to Kyra. Kyra was heartbroken. She cried for days, and I did my best to comfort her. But deep down, I knew we had done the right thing. We couldn't keep enabling his bad behavior. He needed to learn responsibility. It was during one of these emotional conversations that Kyra said something that caught me off guard. She said, "I wish I had left with him." I asked her to explain, and she said, "I know what he did was wrong, but he's still my son, and I can't just abandon him. I don't know how he's doing. He's not answering my calls. I'm concerned about his safety." My heart sank. I hadn't expected her to say that. Of course, I understood Jill was her child, but I had thought we were united in our decision to make him responsible. I understood it was hard for her, but it was also difficult for us to have him around. His behavior was toxic. He had no respect for anyone. A few months passed, and after many attempts, Jill finally responded to Kyra, telling her he was couch surfing with a friend in the next town over. He hadn't come to terms with his actions, but at least he had found a part-time job. Ellie, our daughter, seemed to be adjusting. She was coming out of her shell again, no longer walking on eggshells at home. The tension had finally lifted. She even told me she wanted to rejoin her tennis school. Kyra and I are still working through this. I love her deeply, and I hope, in time, she'll understand that what I did was for Jill's own good. It was a bold move, but sometimes tough love is the only way to help someone grow. Stopping Jill's tuition and pushing him out was difficult, but it was necessary. This was not an easy decision to make, and it hurt, but it was a step towards Jill learning responsibility. He may not have acknowledged the consequences yet, but at least he was making small steps towards self-sufficiency. As for Kyra and me, we're still working through the emotional fallout, but I'm hopeful that in time, she will see the wisdom behind the tough choices made for Jill's future.